Paranormal Karen, she's so spooky. Paranormal Karen, funny too. Paranormal Karen, she's so spooky. Oh, and did I mention she's funny too? Yeah, cha-cha-cha.
Hey everybody, welcome to Paranormal Karen. So excited to be here. I have Karl Pfeiffer with me. You may have listened to the Jim Perry episode. Well, I got all excited when he told me about the Estes method. Is that right? Estes, Karl?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the one.
Okay. I always want to say Estes because isn't it Estes Park?
It's a lot of people I find from the East Coast will pronounce it that way, but typically closer out west, we all just kind of mumble it Estes. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we go to way too much trouble to pronounce crap. And you may remember him from Ghost Hunter Academy. He is a great photographer. We're going to give his website karlpfeiffer.com, and you got to check out everything he's got going on there. That's terrific. And also for a while there, he's going to tell us his great stories about the Stanley Hotel, which is we all know that is connected to Stephen King's book. And I think that is my big promo. Hello, Karl. Good to have you on.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I went to text you and your phone number came up as it's already in my contacts.
Spooky.
I know. So I'm thinking I did do a paranormal convention it was my very first one and it was at the Stanley. And I'm wondering if that's where I met you. It was, God, I can't remember his name. I think it was Dan and he was a big guy from Texas. Maybe it wasn't Dan. You must do all the conventions there, right?
Yeah, back when a lot of the paranormal events were rolling through, I would definitely make appearances a lot. Sometimes I'd be asked to speak at them since I was local. Helped out leading the ghost hunts on those. So I was usually lurking around in some capacity or another for most of them. So that would make sense.
Okay, so that's probably it. Well, I hope we had a good time. We must have had such a good time, I don't remember.
Right.
Which is great. So tell me, what is your story of how you got into the paranormal or what happened with you?
It's been a very kind of gradual buildup for me. I find talking to people that there's sort of two different sides on how they get into it. It either seems like the paranormal reaches out and grabs them from a young age. They have a lot of experiences that they're trying to figure out later in life. Or I think for the other half of us, and more where I come from, there's always just been this like deep passion and kind of fixation on that. And I've always had that sort of love and desire to learn more about the mysterious and the dark and the creepy. And that manifests in a more tangible approach in trying to study something like ghost experiences or of late, more broader realm of high strangeness, where I can actually kind of go out on my own and try to encounter those types of experiences and learn more about what's going on in those more mysterious corners of our world. And so for me, it's been chasing down experiences or the possibility of experience rather than starting out growing up in a haunted house or something like that. So it's always been with me, you know. And obviously the ghost hunters craze was definitely rolling through when I was in high school. It kind of started out. So when I was in college, I was at a good place to try to figure out where I could jump on board that train. So I wound up applying. I was keeping my ear to the ground on the internet, and I heard that the TAPS guys, the Ghost Hunters guys, were developing a spin-off show that was going to be Ghost Hunters College Edition, was the original name for it. And so I kind of looked around and I found a couple of different casting directions, and I wound up getting selected for the show, which as it became was Ghost Hunters Academy, and was sort of a training. That first season was kind of a semi-elimination competition show. It was a little bit messy, but I wound up doing 6 episodes of that, winning it along with Susan Slaughter, and then I did an episode with Ghost Hunters International before kind of never really got called back, and that was that. So finished up my schooling and at the university and wound up working at the Stanley Hotel as the resident paranormal investigator there for 5 years. Alongside some dear friends and investigators. We put together a web series towards the end of that run called Spirits of the Stanley, where I got to exercise a little bit more of my video skills, kind of up with the photography stuff that I do. And then that segued into a whole strange 2 years right now of very odd projects that will be starting to see the light of day here in the next few months. So it's a pretty exciting time to finally be able to talk about some of the later end stuff, but a whole bunch of stuff in between. So there's
great.
plenty to chat about tonight.
Yes, and if these I always pre-tape, so this will be out in November. So if anything exciting happens or you need to promo it, you just call me back and we will get it out there. And I think now that sounds fantastic. Now you said go out alone. Are you doing some investigating alone or looking at other? What are you doing alone? Because I just went alone. What the hell? Alone. We'll never know you if you get
right.
If you end up on an alien ship, we'll never know what happened.
Hey, if they want me, they just have to show up at my window and beam me up, basically. So that could happen at any time. But no, I don't do too much on my own per se. But I do have a small group of close friends and colleagues that I'll go out with in smaller groups. So it's a less formal affair for me. I don't really care for the team dynamic so much lately. I consider myself as more of a consultant for the local teams. So there's always a small group of us, but it's very rare that I'll ever go out by myself. Less so because I think that dynamic is interesting with the spirits. I think validation is super important, and you don't want to go falling through any floorboards by yourself either, so.
Right. And I find there's a truck backing up outside my house. I find that when you go alone, your imagination can get the best of you, or you can be sort of at that different heightened state. So it always is good to have someone there with you. And I do a lot with my friends. There's only one team I'm a part of, and it's actually as everybody in the paranormal knows, it can get very competitive, or sometimes you got to have the perfect team to really but go out alone. I get what you mean now, like find your own projects and do this and that. That's awesome. And have you so we have to start out with this. Have you seen anything or had one really experience that stands out more than the others?
Yeah, it's what's been interesting was I investigated probably by my count, it was right around 250 times at the Stanley Hotel before I wound up leaving there. And, every time I think about it, so many of the more minor type things blur together in my mind, that there's a couple of standouts still. And in a twist, one of the standout stories that always pops to mind first was actually in my first couple months up at the hotel. Before I got officially hired on as an investigator, I would come up and sort of tag along and help out with the resident ghost hunter at the time, Callie, back in those early days. And there was one night that we went up to do a little investigating, just a couple of us. It was myself, my good friend Connor, that I do a lot of work with now, and then Callie. And we were in one of the more haunted rooms, 1402. Is it 1402? 1302. I'm sorry. Went to the other Stephen King book. 1302, which is in the manor house, the lodge, which was more of the bachelor pad, the smaller version of the main building up there on the campus.
And I think that's the one I stayed in. And just for everybody, and in the Stephen King book was the Stanley was the inspiration, but the Overlook was a different hotel. So it was right? Am I correct?
Yeah, he stayed up there very late in the season one year back when the Stanley was a seasonal hotel, like 1976 or so, and very kind of desolate at that point. The hotel was not the way it is today, where it's booming all year round. And he was working on a story about a family in isolation, which apparently was initially conceived to be in like an amusement park. But after his visit up at the hotel while he was working down at CU Boulder, that's where everything clicked and the story kind of developed in his mind overnight. And so it was the inspiration for the Overlook. The Stanley doesn't have the tortured past that hotel did, and is yet to burn to the ground. Spoiler alert. But it was kind of that inspiration. And then, of course, the movie took a lot more liberties than the Stephen King book, which kind of took it another step even further away, in that a lot of people think that the Kubrick movie was shot there at the Stanley, but it wasn't. But the miniseries that Stephen King did that he tried to get to stay more true to his book, that was shot at the Stanley Hotel. So that's obvious, kind of some confusion for most folks who haven't visited, but
Right.
very tied in with that shining circle there, the Stanley Hotel is.
And that Stanley Hotel is just gorgeous. And when I did the paranormal convention out there, I had to leave early in the morning for my flight, and I had to wait for the moose to cross the street. Like, it was just, right, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of wildlife right there. But if I remember correctly, and then I have to tell you something weird. I go visit my parents in upstate New York, and I do a weekly little Paranormal Karen that's a comedy web series. They're a minute long. And while I was looking for places in upstate New York, there is a place called the Shanley, not the the Shanley, that I had never heard of, where two little twin girls died in there. And there was another thing where for a minute I was like, did I read this wrong? Am I looking in Colorado? So I think that there's a bleed over. I had never heard it, that, but upstate New York, Maine, that's Stephen King's area. So I think there was a little bleed over there.
Absolutely. As a writer, you never really know. Sometimes it's even hard to remember where your inspiration comes from. So I think certainly being in that neck of the woods, you might have drawn some inspiration from different hotels and different areas and different stories as well, or just the synchronicity of perhaps such a similarly named hotel having such similar stories that he conceived for via a completely different hotel.
Right. And so the Stanley as it is now, there's the main room, the main place, which is just gorgeous. And then the place you're talking about is, I know there's a theater. When you're facing it, the theater is off to the right, correct? Mm-hmm. Which is, the little theater was so haunted when I was there. And then are the places you're talking about now the ones over to the left, which I believe I stayed in? They're buildings off of the building, correct?
Yeah, so there's that big, large main building that's kind of the iconic one. Then you go immediately to the right, kind of towards the east, and there's like a smaller version of that main one that has plenty of guest rooms as well. They've tried to make it more of a bed and breakfast type feel, kind of in that one building on its own. And then you go just a little bit further down the hill to the concert hall, which is where, as you mentioned, a lot of the paranormal investigations that I did took place in that building, because it was the easiest to sort of lock down and make it our own without interfering with, guests passing through.
Right. Okay. So now the story I interrupted you from 20 minutes ago. So your first experience in 1302.
Yeah. So, and it was my first time in 1302. I was very excited because until then, like I said, we'd investigated only the concert hall for the couple of nights that I'd been up there. So this was my first guest room experience. It's a really lovely room. The 1302 it's very big, very spacious. Now, and it was, this is the classic. It's also my most ironic story, because it was a quiet night. We had not really gotten much activity. And in those first couple of months, things just seemed to be hopping. So this was one of my first quiet nights. And it was around 1 a.m. probably. And there's the three of us in the room. I was laying on the bed. And of course, the only time in my entire experience this ever happened, I started to doze off a little bit. Right. So, trying to fight it, of course, to stay awake on the investigation there, but not much was happening.
That happens to people during my podcast all the time. They're fighting to stay awake.
I don't know about that, but maybe they'll have an experience like mine, so even cooler. But
yeah,
I used to joke about this on our ghost hunts all the time. I said, try not to fall asleep because it's important to stay high energy, but maybe you'll have a weird experience like I did, so who knows? But I found myself in what I've later described as like the hypnagogic state, which is kind of when you're half asleep, half awake. Some of your more conscious mind might be shutting down a little bit, but there is still more of a subconscious awareness, perhaps, which is a state that a lot of people will link towards different varieties of paranormal experience, whether that's psychical or ghostly or whatnot. And as I doze off, I start to have this extremely vivid dream just immediately pop into my head. And it was almost like I was looking out through a peephole in a door, and there was this kind of creature looking back at me that, as I recall, it seemed like it was dressed in like a suit or something, like a human, but the face was half man, half pig. And
wow.
So very, very eerie, very strange, kind of like bald head, maybe a couple wispy little hairs. But the most jarring aspect, there's these two goblin ears sticking off as well. But the most jarring aspect was, instead of eyes, there was only these two eye sockets looking back at me. And so I was looking at this thing for a second or two, and the strange part, I don't know if it was the dream space or not, but it didn't frighten me at all. Like, I didn't have like a scared reaction to it at all. It was totally calm. And I was looking at it, it was looking back at me. And as soon as my conscious brain kicked in and said, wait, that's a little weird, I snapped out of it. So woke up, I was out for like 10 seconds tops. Like, it was not like I dozed off for half an hour. And I kind of grunted, and Callie and Connor were like, what? Something happened. And I said, well, it's weird. And I explained this thing to him. And Callie says, Carl, you're freaking me out. And I was like, no, like, I don't get like an evil vibe from it at all. Like, I'm not even disquieted. And she says, no, you're freaking me out because Madame Vera, who's like the resident psychic at the hotel, she's got a little office space in the basement of the main building where she gives readings. She apparently described to Callie that exact same thing in that exact same room about a year before that. To which then it was kind of my turn to be like, now you're freaking me out. That adds a little bit of validation to it. But even weirder still, the research I did the following month, I was writing some articles for the Taps Pair magazine at the time. And I was writing about their visit to Leap Castle in Ireland, which has always been one of my favorite episodes of that show back in the day. And obviously that case revolved around the elemental spirits that was at that Leap Castle. And I was reading some of the original journal entries that the owner's wife at the time had written. She was the first to experience this entity on the grounds there. And that elemental spirit, which, by the way, Manavira said that was an elemental spirit that she had experienced that was older than the hotel itself. So there was that link there. Wow. So as I was reading about this other elemental, it was described as being like of a shape that was like half human, half animal, and with two eyes that were either so black that they were or just looked like eye sockets. And I was like, that is a very crazy consistency there, in that I didn't know that information, at least consciously, before I had my experience, and yet it all kind of linked up in a validation sense after the fact. So
wow.
I'm not one prone to psychic experiences. I see very little visual phenomena on ghost hunting, but that was such a random, vivid experience that added up later in hindsight. It was a very strange kind of welcome to just the property in general around even the hotel that night.
You know, it's such a and it's funny. I'm kind of looking for an elemental or an expert, and for some of my listeners that are kind of new to the paranormal, because my podcast kind of filters through comedy into people that are interested in the paranormal, and the elemental, that is such an elemental and fairy realm is so overlooked. And I think when you are in Ireland, because they are with the legends of the fairies, it's almost more in their consciousness, but it's kind of fascinating that we, for some reason over in America, we don't think of that. So when we see these crazy-ish things, we don't quite understand as much as, other people, but elementals are fascinating.
Oh yeah. They've been very much on my radar with some of my recent work, because, even you start to look into some, like a lot of my recent research for the last 3 or 4 years even has been into more of the ufological kind of perspective. And you start reading works by like Jacques Vallée and John Keel who start to link in a lot of those older legends and cultural stories about these things like elementals or the fae that start to tie into more of that alien ufological type elements of the research as well. And it starts to seem like we're talking about more and more of the same thing. So that's been very much in my background recently to tie into that first Stanley experience. But in that broader sense, it's very much something that is considered in completely different context over the pond in Ireland and those kind of areas versus America, where everything's so polarized right now. You know, everything's either like a human spirit or it's a demon, and there's not really too much in between. But I think that people are starting to get more of a sense for that kind of variety right now.
And
I was watching.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, yeah. I was just saying, like, it's starting to expand and get over here, I think, a little bit, and that I think people are starting to get a little bit more interested in the inhuman side of things. That's not necessarily a purely evil. Like, if you're interested in that, it means you're into demons and stuff. Like, I think the open mindedness is starting to spread. Even, that all said, with words of caution, because the Fae are not entirely pleasant, friendly type creatures, and you want to be very careful with that kind of a world.
Yeah, I have had a very, very bad experience with a fairy that was a puka that it was sort of resembles a bunny at times. And I keep telling my audience I'm going to tell this story, but I tell it in one of my stand-up routines, and I want to get it funny. Like, I want to get a funny taping of it so I can play it that way. But yeah, the Fae or the elemental, they have a different set of sort of a different morality or a different consciousness than we do. And it's almost, it's almost like sometimes I think we walk into places thinking, yeah, well, we're humans and God's with us. So, nothing bad's going to happen. And that's not true. I just had Joshua Kutchin on, and he was connecting the missing 411, the people that are going missing from national parks. He has that completely connected to fairy lore. And it's a perfect connection that no one's really looked into.
Oh yeah, I know David Paulides, in his research with the missing 411 stuff, is very, like, it's part of his characteristic of his research that he doesn't draw any conclusions from it, as you know. But when you start to study that and you start to notice the context of a lot of other stuff that's going on in the bigger picture sense, the Fae perspective on the missing 411 stuff starts to get very interesting with some of those connections, and I'm super fascinated in that world right now.
Yeah, and it's funny because I have a lot of woo woo friends. That's what I call them, woo woo friends. We're all into it. I read tarot during the day, and we're all on. And I remember once saying fairy and having someone of my complete woo woo friends look at me like, are you kidding? What are you, you know what I mean? Like, I think if you put out a show right now, you'd have a hard time pitching that because people are okay with ghosts and demons, but anything between there, we don't know if we believe you.
I think it's time to start broadening those horizons imminently. But I think it's a matter of kind of approaching it in a way that people can follow, because people do have that construct right now where we've accepted kind of ghosts. And while aliens might not be as accepted right now, they're a little bit more popular, and we had like the X-Files in the 90s and everything happening then to kind of, if not ground it, at least secure it in the public eye. So I think between those two things in that realm of Fae in between, and I always compare inhuman spirits to like the living world. It's just like, if you consider inhuman things here in the land of the living, like we have the entire variety of the animal kingdom. Who's to say that the spirit world isn't equally as diverse in ways just beyond animals as well? And so I think introducing those elements of the inhuman and segueing the lore over here into America in a way that illustrates how interesting it is, but also how much of an arm's length you should keep it at without the proper protections and education about it. I think it's a good time for it, because I think we need some variety right now.
I do too. And you know what? I like the way you said that it's how, you said how it's constructed as it's presented, which is the key. In fact, I think it's now that, I think I'm 50 episodes into my podcast, something like that. I like that. Sometimes investigators, they used to always go, well, I'm a skeptic. I'm very much a skeptic. We're all skeptics because everybody was in this field was so used to being made fun of. You had to sort of defend yourself before the question was even asked. And I'm always like, oh no, I'm in on everything. I'm obsessed with the Mothman. Tell me your story. I want to know.
Don't get me started on Mothman either. It's funny how much stuff we're talking about here that just connects to things I can't talk about yet. So I'm very entertained by all of these topics coming up.
Oh, good. Well, actually, I believe my Mothman episode should be out before this one, but now, I'm going to follow you everywhere now. Now you've got a stalker. If you said Mothman, I have the T-shirt that says Mothman is my boyfriend. And okay,
come January, we'll have a lot to talk about.
Oh, come back. We'll have you back on the show. So that's a fascinating experience. And then, so you kind of became the paranormal investigator for the Stanley or, leading event, which I think is interesting because, I didn't have a lot of experience in the room. Did you find that, the more you were there, the more comfortable the entities or elementals became with you?
Yeah. So, I mean, that was kind of a whole unfolding ordeal. So, in terms of anything elemental, that was a very brief encounter. We did experience some presences over the years in different areas of the property that I would kind of label inhuman, but again, not evil. But they were kind of few and far in between, very reclusive presences. I think they liked sort of the quieter areas and didn't really run into us too much while we were doing our thing with the public groups. But there was definitely an ebb and flow to the activity at the hotel. I think that back in its heyday, shortly after Ghost Hunters kind of came around there, it was such a quiet property at that point. It wasn't nearly as famous and active with community stuff and visitors as it is now. And I think that those spirits were more excited and able and prepared to engage back then. So I think that there was kind of an initial decrease in activity to some extent over the first few years, if not like a full almost decade, that kind of like slowly kind of eased off. But I started up there at the hotel I started visiting in 2010. And then I started on in January of 2011 as the resident investigator. And then I spent the next 5 years after that doing it. In that time, it did die off, but I think I see it from a very psychological perspective for the spirits. Like, we really considered them by the end of our time there like friends of ours.
Right.
And we looked at them as people. And when you host these weekend ghost hunts down on the property, we would do as many as anywhere from 1 to 3 in a weekend, depending on the time of year. And the challenge for us was that, as cool as it was to be ghost hunting as a job, we were also trying to educate people, because a lot of these were just tourists passing through or something to do. The wife or the boyfriend was really into this stuff, and somebody's tagging along, just okay, cool, they're doing it, they're into it. So a lot of it was educating them in how to do it, what the methodology is, and what some of the philosophy is in doing it. My goal by the end of my time up there was not to convince skeptics, but if the skeptic left, not even with an experience, because that wasn't necessarily ever a given, but I wanted them to leave with a respect. If they go in snorting at all the stories we're telling, and they leave going, that was really interesting, I didn't experience anything, but I have a lot more respect for what it is that you're trying to do now each night when you do this. That was usually my goal. So for the spirits, that I think got a little bit old, because we're asking by necessity many of the same questions. Our procedure each night was very much the same. And while we tried our best to mix it up and make them feel comfortable, at the end of the day, it was a challenge. They were kind of like animals in a zoo, or, the attractions on a ride. And we were hyper aware of that at a lot of the times. And we did our best to be friendly and understanding with them, but it's going to get a little bit boring for those spirits over time. So that was a challenge, was trying to keep it fresh for the spirits as well. But the activity did get more and more scattered as we went, I think, due to that dynamic of just oversaturation.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you can't, you have nothing to offer them. You know what I mean? Hey, you guys, like an actor, if you show up at 5, we're going to feed you, and you get a residual check. And they're just yeah, we need an emotional response, or more to get that. But you must have, that's really, I have to go back. Have you had more, so you found more elementals than just the one you saw there, which I find it interesting that it was in a suit.
Yeah, right.
If you're going to be in the next dimension, you should be comfortable. If I'm an elemental, I'm in sneakers. That's exactly
right. That was one of the stranger parts. And even to that end, there hasn't been too much even in my research yet that's kind of spoke to that more. I mean, you see it as a trope where animal-headed human figures is kind of a trope in a lot of more like folklore and legends and less like a paranormal kind of angle. So I haven't seen exactly a one-to-one connection. To this day, I don't know if that was more of an impression I got, like my brain interpreting it, or if that was actually like part of what I saw. But that was kind of a strange element that never really came back up at any point later. But the rest of it, when it came to whether you call them elementals or just more of like an inhuman presence, that was more of a physical interaction type stuff rather than that sort of potential psychic projection or whatever it was that I experienced first. It was more of there were certain nights that, like, again, I don't consider myself a sensitive, but when you're in the same location night after night, being able to investigate, you do get used to the feel of the room and the feel of certain entities that might come around, and you're like, oh, this is like a friendly presence right now. There's a good energy here. Maybe it's our spirit Lucy. There were other nights that felt there was certain movements of shadows. There was certain kind of like, I mean, again, it's just a feeling, which I hate to say because my left brain or right brain or whichever it is very grounded and strays away from the feeling side of it. But there's a certain point that you can't really deny what feels like being watched or being scrutinized, almost like a predator. People on certain nights had kind of experiences of like almost like a dog or a wolf or hyena like in their face breathing on them. They could feel like the breath, like very strange kind of animalistic stuff that again, though, it wouldn't be interactive, which is part of the reason I kind of call it inhuman, is we could never get conversation out of it. It was never interacting through our devices, but it was a very powerful presence in the room around us that was very uncomfortable and disquieting. Again, not like an evil kind of discomfort, like we're smelling sulfur and somebody's head spinning around, but like, again, like I can only relate it to like an intelligent animal in the room with you, which is not in a dark room particularly pleasant. But
No,
then it'd be gone the next week, that sort of thing. So it was very kind of fleeting and only came up probably in a handful of nights.
And also when people are interested in this stuff and you don't necessarily know them, you'd have no idea what they may have brought in with them.
Yeah. And most of these nights were actually really interesting. Because I think a lot of those more elemental nights that I speak of were on investigations that we were by ourselves, as just a team of us, or it was like late one night in an event weekend before the guests had started to investigate, which in its own right could have people bringing stuff in. You get TV show investigators coming by, who knows what they've got from all their stuff. So, but that was definitely a factor that we dealt with at the hotel a lot because, it was kind of cottage cheese. There was new guests every week. It is a hotel. Who knows if the spirit world acts the same, where there's spirits that come and go. But that was something that we constantly had to contend with, was when we were getting interaction from something that we were familiar with, and when we were getting action with something that a guest had potentially brought along, or was something that was just kind of passing through.
And that hotel is in the wilderness.
Yeah, it's up in the mountains. It's about 45 minutes away from the closest city down the mountain.
Yeah, it's so if you're going to get elementals, that seems like the place to get them. And before we get to the Estes method, which I love, there is a photo of you. This is very interesting because I love the ghost photo. I love the still photo more than the video. And so you are a photographer, but I just interviewed a woman and her book is called The Ghost Photographer. And I had never done this, but she uses smoke in her photography, which I was always like, nothing. I don't even want to be breathing cold. You know what I mean? I wanted that purity to see. And then I was talking to someone else who said, no, we do that too. And you have a picture. I don't know if that was just a photo you were taking, but you were putting smoke in the photo. Was that just for effect, or do you actually photograph like that?
Most of the photography that I do, pretty much like 99% of it is typically like creative and conceptual and portrait photography. So despite it being my background and despite having some experiments in mind, I haven't really applied it too much on investigations. It's something that since the Stanley anyways, we've been kind of searching for a good case study type location that can kind of fill the Stanley's void that it left here in Colorado for some more ongoing research. And I've got many experiments in the photographic realm that I kind of like to do. But that type, when it comes to smoke photography, I love shooting smoke for portraits. But for ghost photos, it's not as much. The part of the problem of being a photographer by profession and being a ghost hunter is I become like super, super, super critical of like every ghost photo I've ever seen. So,
Right.
I've never taken a ghost photo myself that I've liked, that I've thought was something. And it's even harder to look at someone else's because I can either write it off as this or that, or I'm like, that's cool, I can't explain it, but not having been there, for me, it's not proof because these days when it comes to photography, without a second layer of validation or without support that there wasn't some sort of manipulation there, or a person even, that got in your shot, people are confident as the day is long that, there was nobody in the shot. But I've seen the human element far too often kind of fail people working at the Stanley, that I'm quite the skeptic when it comes to photography. So
yeah,
it's
somebody could have a camera strap in there, or it's a reflection, or whenever they start with mirror, I'm like, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know enough about that smoke method to like knock it or like not be a fan or anything like that. But on the surface, like my struggle with that would be like, if you get a figure, walking through, great. But I also know that smoke is one of the best mediums to have that matrixing pareidolia effect where you can kind of start to see anything you want in it, which is just a struggle of mine. At the end of the day, I think when it comes to any kind of ghost evidence, there's, I say evidence in quotes because I don't like that word much, but it's too easy to use. But like, there's like 98% of a spectrum where like most of it's explainable. But when it comes to any interaction, I do concur that there's a certain degree at the very end where it's just like, that's probably just pareidolia, but damn if that isn't a really good human face. You know what I mean? Like there's always that certain level of like, well, maybe, so I try to be open-minded at the end of the day.
Yeah. We do our best. So, okay. So now we're going to go all the way, for my listeners. You talk about the I would say Estes method, but I love that you named it and you got it out there. And I know it's been, as a comedian, I know all my crystal jokes got stolen and put on Tumblr. So I wanted to get you right on here since you're the guy that this should be credited to tell us about it. And, we're going to start with, for my listeners that don't know, do you use a shack hack or what do you use in this? And we'll explain, some of my listeners might not have ghost hunting equipment, so feel free to over explain.
Oh yeah, happy to. So towards the end of our time at the hotel, our regular resident investigators at that point were, again, Connor Randall, my good friend, fellow investigator there, and Michelle Tate, who was on season 2 of Ghost Hunters Academy and I think like season 9 of Ghost Hunters. So we were the ones running the show there. Those were the cohorts in the web series I was working on. And again, the web series is called Spirits of the Stanley. So if any of your listeners are more curious about this experiment, we actually basically created it in the midst of shooting that. So you can watch it originate basically in real time by rewatching the web series. So if you look that up, you can see how it developed and grew. And
YouTube, or it's on, obviously it's click on your website somewhere, correct?
Yes, there are some links there. It aired in one format on a media website called the Dark Zone. It's a paranormal website. It is like a login sort of thing to watch it on that, but it is free. So you're safe to get a free account, check it out there, or you can also look up Spirits of the Stanley on Facebook or Spirit Investigations Team on Facebook. And we've got them all at that link as well in the full episodes. But yeah, so this idea had been with me for a long time. As best I can remember, it had come up in one of those late night after investigation conversations when you're hanging out in the dark spooky room at the Stanley at 3 a.m. and having a conversation about the field. So I can only imagine it was between me and the ghost hunter at the time, Callie, and I don't remember any specifics about how it came up, who came up with it, anything like that. But it was probably 3 or 4 years later that we were having an interesting night at the Stanley, shooting our web series, just the three of us and our camera guy Wyatt. And I kind of thought, let's try this experiment. Let's finally try this. So basically, the fundamental component of it is, some people call it a shack hack. The technical model that we used was the SP7, but it's a spirit box. It's a broken radio, a glorified broken radio. Now, the way it works is you'll select either FM or AM, and the fancier ones, the shack hack just basically has the tuner stop taken out. So, you can tune through the radio stations, and it, hits each one until it stops on a clear. The shack hack originally just took out that stopper so that it would continuously scan the radio frequencies.
So that's the one on the machine that people hear.
Exactly. So you're going to hear a bunch of white noise, and then little DJ voices and songs, and stop here, and and it just kind of goes through.
Which is, by the way, still my favorite piece of equipment, and I literally have the shack hack radio. I have the little black.
The original, yeah.
You can't get them anymore, I don't think, because no one wants them radio.
Well, and that's how it started. Was just, as far as I understand, the shack hack was. It's kind of a one setting, like AM or FM, but it scans, and that's that. So the SP7 was kind of like somebody took that concept and refined it. So you can scan through at different speeds, and you can, change the volume and yada yada.
And the appeal of different speeds is, for folks that don't know, you might hear, mine goes very slow. So you might hear a word like California. Or it'll go over it, and some stations will last longer. And you're trying to get, how would you explain that? You're trying to get a spirit to use that white noise to ride the vibration and say something. Is that a good explanation?
It could be. And this is the real challenge to it all. And part of the reason we made the experiment is it's a really controversial device, right? Like a lot of like good friends of mine, in this paranormal field hate the spirit box, because they basically see it as 100% a false positive generator, because you're getting so much white noise, you're getting blips of sound. If it's going slower, like, you're going to definitely hear clearer words and sentences because you have more time on each station to hear something.
Right.
But it's very easy to kind of like, twist those answers into something that's relevant, or hear what you want to hear. And I was always kind of on the fence, because I totally support all of that. Like, I think that that's 100% true. But I've also heard some like really, really strange, crazy, loud, shouted, clear answers over the device when running normally through a speaker in the past. That's made me think, I don't know how a spirit uses that. Skeptics say spirits don't grow radio transmitters out of their heads when they die. I say, well, we don't know, so we shouldn't discount it. But even though that's probably not true, I don't know how they can transmit. But I've heard some weird stuff. I'm going to stay open-minded. But yeah, I hate it a little bit too, but I like to use it. It's controversial.
I had my last name come through, Rontowski, and I always think when I use it, you want to ask questions where the answer has 3 or 4 syllables, or and I knew a team that had a guy on it that had no voice box, and he was literally the electronic. He was the EVP phenomenon, that since he didn't have the sound, but it was like this, you would hear their voices as though they were riding the vibration that he was putting out without his voice box, without it being loud.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, when it comes to the spirit box, there's a million different kind of techniques and things that you can do with it to try to refine that. But that is the one thing I encourage most when it comes to that, is just to be, just be critical of what you're hearing, and wait for the really good stuff and not try to force it. But in that refinement, though, that's where the Estes method was born. We always had this concept where finally, when we tried to do it, we basically took that idea of, look, if we're playing this thing through a speaker, everyone can hear it. We ask a question, everyone's going to listen for that answer, or something that could be an answer for that. What if we cut out all expectation, all like hearing what we want, what we want to hear, and we take the spirit box, there's a headphone jack, so we plug a headphone jack into it. We put on headphones, and over time we added a blindfold as well. And basically turn the volume up. The headphones we started using, Connor's a drummer, so he's got these like very good noise canceling headphones that just, they kill like, I don't know, 17 decibels of sound or something. And you basically just try to seal off that person listening to the spirit box so that no one in the group can hear the spirit box, but that one person, all they can hear is that spirit box feed just scanning through those stations. And the rest of the group will ask questions towards that person as if they were a spirit, or towards the spirits, with the idea that that person then, when they hear anything clear, whether they think it's a commercial or not, whatever they can hear listening through that device, they will just say aloud. So basically, the ideal scenario would be if we're asking questions that that person can't hear, but we're getting answers back and forth conversationally, where that person couldn't even hear the question. So they shouldn't, like, the chances of having a conversation and the chances of certain answers coming up in response to certain questions start to, the more you do it, the more, if you get better results, it gets more compelling. It's one thing to have an answer hit every so often, like random answers can work. You say, hey, say something random through the device. The next answer is probably going to be a nice hit for you because you have no specifications, right? But we started to try this thing, and we were blown away by the quality of responses that we were getting.
Genius, Karl. Genius. I just have to yell it.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And it's pretty remarkable because, obviously we are looking for that conversational kind of interaction. And we've gotten to the point, a lot of people have been really excited about this. A lot of people have picked it up. It's been on a number of TV shows at this point. And, a lot of the fan communities are trying it out. It can be a little difficult for people to get into it first if you're listening, because it is very unsettling to listen to that staticky feed and voices really loudly. It can give you a headache. So, small increments when starting out, but we'll run it for, these days, Connor's very good at it. It would seem we'll run it for an hour easy with him on that box. And the biggest question, we had a number of questions come up with it. We developed a number of different experiments to try to test some of those questions. But the biggest question, even to this day, is whether or not they're actually hearing those voices through the feed, whether or not the spirits are actually using the spirit box, or if that sound and that focus and not hearing anything in the room, the blindfold on, if that might be luring them into a meditative state where they're, like I talked about with my earlier Pigman story, if they might be in a state where they're more sensitive to psychical type responses, that may be filtered through the subconscious mind. Your conscious mind is expecting to hear words at any given moment. Maybe that allows like a psychical subconscious sense to sort of express those words in a mental capacity, but where the conscious brain just thinks that it heard it,
Right. And
that's kind of it's kind of a theory I've been operating on for a little while, that the conscious brain, in its not believing in psychic phenomena, might actually repress it. But if you give it an avenue that the conscious brain can accept that something else is the agent for the phenomena, it might allow it to happen. That's a long story. That's a tangent. But in that case here, it's like, oh yeah, anything could be said through this device. We're waiting to hear it. The subconscious psychical brain might be able to say, okay, here's your answer. So at this point, we continue to go back and forth on it constantly about whether it's the box, whether it's a psychic thing, and back and forth. But regardless, we continue to get crazy stuff with it and see other people get crazy stuff with it, that we're constantly trying to continue to experiment and learn more and more about it.
And for people that haven't been on something like this, you may have seen it on the shows. And what happens is you got this constant noise of which usually I find the spirits are yelling, turn it down. And then someone will say, how many people are in this room? And you'll hear, and everyone will go, I heard 6. Someone will say, I tend to lay back on that because my hearing is so bad and I let other people lead. But that sounds, have you ever tried it with the people in 2 different rooms?
Mm-hmm. Yep. That was one of the experiments that we did at the Stanley while we were still up there after inventing it. Our biggest, well, not our biggest, one of our questions we had was whether or not the spirits were in the room with us, whether they could throw their answers or listen distantly to a question. So we basically put one person on one end of the basement in the concert hall and put the other person on the opposite end of the building up in the balcony on the second level in the concert hall. And we did the experiment via baby monitors. So we could hear the responses from the person on the box through the baby monitor, but they could not hear the question broadcast at all because the baby monitors, of course, are one way. That one, we only had the chance, and the unfortunate part with the Stanley kind of cutting ties with ghosts that spring was we had all these experiments. We kind of did a couple of them once or twice, but as any good experiment should be done, you should do it a lot more, So it's tough to draw too many conclusions from one outing because that night we got a couple of interesting responses, but it wasn't super compelling. That was like, oh yeah, that spirit could either hear us or send answers really well. But at the same time, maybe the spirits didn't get it. Maybe they weren't really around so much that night. We tried to do a control beforehand to see if they're around, but obviously, that's a good example of why you should do an experiment multiple times before you draw conclusions. But we did try it in 2 different rooms.
Fascinating. Genius, Karl, genius. And I have not yelled that on my show yet. A quick gossipy question before we go. So the stories of famous people, one was Jim Carrey had a room there and then packed up his bag and I'm never staying. I believe that's the story. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, he was. They filmed a couple scenes in Dumb and Dumber at the Stanley, and so he was staying in room 217, the famous Stephen King suite in the main building. And the story goes that he ran out of there in the middle of the night, told the desk worker, like, I'm out, I'm done, I'm not staying in this building, and he left. The one version goes that he stayed at a hotel down the streets. Another one goes that they put him in the Justice Haunted Manor house next door, but didn't tell him that part, But it's Jim Carrey who knows.
He never said what it was, did he? He
never said what it was. So who knows if it was kind of a stunt or if he genuinely had an experience. But the hotel does stuff like that. So it could be either way.
And also do we know what experience Stephen King had, or was his imagination just going?
It was, as far as I understand, the story usually goes that it was just his imagination. It said that he couldn't sleep, so he took a walk around by himself that night, and then, went to bed and had a nightmare about his, I think, oldest son maybe, was running around in the hallways and one of the old fire hoses that used to be on the walls instead of, sprinkler systems. Became a snake and came off the wall and started chasing his son. Oh. And that scared him and woke him up. And the story goes that he went and sat by the window and lit up a cigarette. And that by the end of the cigarette, he'd had the whole plot for The Shining composed in his head and wrote it over the next couple of months then down in Boulder.
Fascinating. We know anybody else that saw anything in that room, or do we know what we don't know what that is then, do we?
Yeah, some people say that maybe he did have an experience and that might have prompted some of the details, but I haven't seen anything like too strong for that. But 217 is definitely one of the most famous haunted rooms on the property. Good luck booking that one out in the summer season. But it's weird how those rooms work because there's a number of rooms that I've had crazy experiences in that my friends haven't, and there's vice versa for them. 217 is one of those rooms that I've never really had anything happen to me in, but I've heard from other people, plenty of tales about all the general weirdness. But that's probably any haunted location for you.
Wow. Well, a couple of things. Still, we started out with the thing of you're already in my phone, so deja vu. I don't know how
all
that,
over again.
Yes. So now tell everyone where they can find you and your
Yeah,
series.
so of course. So my primary hub, I try to keep everything expanding out of my website. It's karlpfeiffer.com. Very simple. Karl on my name. It's Karl with a K. And then the last name is Pfeiffer, like Michelle Pfeiffer, Pfeiffer. If you can't remember that, just Google that with like Ghost Hunters, and I'm sure Google will correct the spelling of the name, and you can find the website.
And we'll put it in the description of the podcast.
Perfect, even better. And then I spend most of my time on Twitter and Instagram. Look me up under the same name, and links to my projects and my portfolio and my video work and my ghost hunting work, all through the website. If you can find that, you can find any media that catches your eye. Have a good time. Watch some Spirits of the Stanley. Keep tuned for some very exciting new teasers that are, at the time of this airing, I think the teasers are starting to roll out for the Secret Next project in January.
I'm already excited. You had me at Mothman.
I've been sitting on it for over a year, and I'm dying to share it with everybody. It's crazy.
I can't wait. All right, I'll be texting you about that. Karl, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And being very patient with my thousands of emails. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. If you can take a minute and give the podcast a 5-star review, I would appreciate that. Also, if you want to be a sponsor, our numbers are growing really well. They're leaping. I'm so excited. Go to my website. You can sponsor an ad. You can be a private sponsor, whatever you want to do. Please, let's see. We're in November. Remember, I will be at an autism fundraiser November 17th, the weekend after that at Wisecrackers in the Poconos. I can't remember what else. Rontowski, at Rontowski on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and thanks, Karl.
Thank you.
And we're out. Oh, that was awesome, man. I cannot wait. I hope you will be on again when your projects get going.
Oh yeah, definitely. We're gonna do a big media push, but yeah, if you see something and we haven't reached out, like feel free to hit me up. I'm always down to talk more and deeper about paranormal stuff.
Great.
Clearly, so many avenues to go down. So,
and I'm sure you know Dave Schrader. He's up on. He's real easy. You know Schrader, right?
Yeah, I was just talking to him on the phone yesterday, actually.
Oh, great. Yeah, he's my favorite. I always think he's the biggest guy. I cannot stand Coast to Coast AM. But he's, well, wonderful. Well, great, Karl. I hope I run into you again, and I guess it'll be our third time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, keep in touch.
I will. Have a great evening, and thank you so much for your time.
You too. Thanks.
Okay, bye, Karl. People are always asking me, Karen, you are so knowledgeable about tarot, ghosts, and otherworldly spirits. How do you stay so organized and grounded here on Earth? And I have to tell them my secret weapon. It's black tourmaline. And Nita over at nitaapple.com. After years of complaining about all the text messages and emails back and forth, trying to schedule tarot readings and chasing after payments, Nita installed Acuity Scheduler on my website, and now I just get a little ding on my phone, and that tells me someone has made an appointment and the money is already in my account. I love that little ding, except every time it goes off, Courage runs to his food bowl. 5 minutes with Nita can save you 5 hours of bumbling around and trying to do things yourself. So if you spend 10 minutes with her, that'll save you like 72 hours or something like that. I don't know, I'm not good with math, but you know who is? Nita. That's who I would ask. Want to end all the emails back and forth and get paid up front when clients schedule time with you? Then hop on over to nitaapple.com/services and let Nita get you set up with a simple system that will make your life so much easier. Use coupon code BOO4U and get 20% off any products or services. She's got a lot of services and products that can save you time and money. That's BOO4U, all lowercase, BOO, the number 4, the letter U, and get 20% off. That's Nita Apple at nitaapple.com/services. nitaapple.com/services, and make your life easier today.